I don't know where to begin, but I'll try to tell this as clearly as I can. It started as a simple trip to my family's cabin, a place tucked deep into the woods. My plan was to spend a quiet weekend there, catch up on some reading, and maybe do a little hiking if I felt up for it. But that simple trip turned into a nightmare that's haunted me ever since. I got to the cabin around noon. It was just as I remembered it from my childhood. Small, sturdy, with wood-paneled walls and the smell of cedar hanging in the air. The cabin had been in our family for decades, passed down from my grandparents to my parents, and now, in a sense, to me. From the moment I stepped inside, though, something felt off. It was subtle at first, just a twinge of unease, like the feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself I'd probably seen too many horror movies. After a couple of hours unpacking and settling in, I decided to take a quick nap. But before I could even drift off, there was a knock at the door. It was soft and steady, but something about it made my skin crawl. This cabin was isolated, miles away from any other house, and I hadn't seen a single car on the way up. The sound made my heart skip, but I figured maybe someone had just gotten lost. When I opened the door, I saw a man standing there. He was tall, maybe in his mid-50s, with a weathered face and an unsettling grin. He wore a dark coat and a hat that cast a shadow over his eyes. "Afternoon," he said with a drawl, a tone that seemed both friendly and off-putting. "Sorry to bother you, but my truck broke down just a mile back. Could I use your phone?" His voice had an odd quality, almost rehearsed, like he'd practiced those exact words. I hadn't seen any car on my way, but maybe I'd missed it. And he didn't seem dangerous, just strange. I handed him my phone, and he dialed a number, turning his back as he mumbled into it. He finished the call, handed the phone back to me, and thanked me. "Help's on the way," he said with that strange grin. "Mind if I stay here till they arrive?" I hesitated. There was something about him that unnerved me, but I didn't want to be rude. I nodded and gestured for him to sit down in the living room. I took a seat across from him, hoping to make small talk to break the tension. "Where were you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, just around here," he replied vaguely. He glanced away, his eyes shifting as if he were uncomfortable. Then he fell silent, just sitting there, hands on his knees, staring ahead with that eerie grin. After a few minutes of awkward silence, I excused myself to the kitchen, pretending I needed to grab something. The truth was, I just wanted to put some distance between us. But when I came back, he was gone. He hadn't made a sound, and the front door was closed. There were no footsteps, no creaking floorboards, just silence. I checked outside, but there was no sign of him. The road was empty, the forest still. Feeling unsettled, I tried to forget about it, convincing myself he must have slipped out quietly while I wasn't looking. Maybe his ride had arrived, and I'd been too distracted to notice. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race. I kept expecting to hear another knock or see his grinning face outside the window. Just as I was starting to relax, to tell myself I was being ridiculous, I heard a soft, measured knock at the door. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I wanted to stay put, to ignore it, but the knocking continued. Soft, patient, like the ticking of a clock in the silence of the woods. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on my robe, grabbed a flashlight, and crept toward the door. I opened it just a crack, peering into the darkness. No one was there, but as I turned to close the door, I saw a figure at the edge of the trees. A man, barely visible in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It was him, the same man, grinning that strange, unsettling grin. "Need any help?" he called softly, his voice cutting through the night like a whisper in my ear. I slammed the door, bolting it shut, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it. I backed away, feeling the walls close in around me. I wanted to leave, to run, but I was too terrified to step outside. For hours, I sat in the dark, listening, waiting. I expected him to knock again, to try the doorknob, to tap on the windows. But the night remained silent. Finally, just before dawn, I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke, sunlight streaming through the windows, I almost believed it had been a dream. But when I opened the front door, I found something waiting for me on the porch. It was a small bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. My hands shook as I reached for it, torn between fear and morbid curiosity. I untied the twine, unwrapped the cloth, and felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Inside was a bone, small, polished, and unmistakably human. It looked like a finger bone, clean and delicate. I dropped the bundle, stumbling back into the cabin, while rising in my throat. This wasn't a joke. This was real, and whatever was happening here, I needed to get out. I grabbed my keys, threw my bag into the car, and started the engine, desperate to put as much distance as I could between myself and that cabin. But as I turned onto the dirt road, my engine sputtered and died. Frantically, I tried to restart it, turning the key again and again, but it refused to start. In a panic, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was standing in the middle of the road behind me, grinning that same horrible grin. His eyes, which I hadn't been able to see before, were dull, almost glassy, staring straight into my soul. "Leaving so soon?" he drawled, stepping closer. I held my breath, praying he would disappear, praying this was all some twisted nightmare. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. I didn't look back. I just hit the gas, speeding down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city. Even then, the feeling of dread clung to me like a shadow. I tried to tell myself it was over, that he was just some crazy guy in the woods, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next few days, I tried to return to normal life. I went back to work, met up with friends, did everything I could to forget about the man and his chilling grin. But then, late one night, I heard a soft knock on my apartment door. I froze, my heart pounding as I listened. The knock was soft, slow, measured, just like at the cabin. I stayed in bed, barely daring to breathe, hoping he'd go away. But the knocking continued, persistent, patient. Finally, I forced myself to get up and check. I opened the door, my hand shaking, but there was no one there. Just an empty hallway and the quiet hum of the building. But on my doormat, I found a small bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. I could feel the cold weight of fear settling in my stomach. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I knew there was nowhere to go. He'd found me. Every night after that, the knocking returned. Sometimes I'd open the door and see him standing at the end of the hallway, grinning that same horrible grin, his eyes dull and lifeless. Other times, I'd find more bundles on my doorstep, each one containing something more gruesome than the last. A lock of hair, a tooth, a strip of cloth stained with something dark and dried. I stopped calling the police. I stopped talking to my friends about it. No one believed me, and after a while, I didn't blame them. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Last night, I woke to find him standing at the foot of my bed. He was closer than ever, his face mere inches from mine, his breath cold against my skin. I could see every line on his face, every shadow, every crease. His eyes, lifeless and glassy, bored into mine, and I felt paralyzed, trapped in his gaze. "You let me in once," he whispered, his voice a low, chilling hiss. "I'll always find you now." Then, just like that, he vanished. I stayed up the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes, too terrified to even move. I knew that this wasn't something I could run from. Wherever I went, he would follow. This morning, I packed a bag and left my apartment without a second thought. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I figured the less anyone knew, the safer they'd be. Somehow, I knew that whatever this was, it was only interested in me. I drove for hours, taking every back road I could find, hoping that somehow I could lose him. By the time night fell, I'd ended up in a rundown motel off the highway, miles from anywhere familiar. The room was damp and cold, the wallpaper peeling, and the bed creaked whenever I moved. But it felt safe enough at least. I didn't turn on any lights, hoping that if he was looking for me, he'd pass right by. Exhausted, I lay down, finally letting my eyes close. I told myself I was safe here. Just one night without the knocks, without the grinning face, and I'd figure out what to do next. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I heard it, a soft, familiar knock. It was faint at first, almost like I was imagining it, but then it grew louder, more insistent. echoing through the silence of the room. My stomach twisted as I sat up, my eyes darting to the door. I knew, without a doubt, that he was standing on the other side, waiting. I couldn't face him again. Not now. Not when I'd finally managed to put some distance between us. I stayed rooted to the spot, hoping he'd leave, but the knocking continued. When I couldn't take it anymore, I steeled myself and crept toward the door, heart pounding. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Silence. I waited, barely breathing, my hand hovering over the lock. Finally, I heard the softest whisper from the other side, so quiet I could barely make it out. "You can't hide forever." A shiver ran down my spine. I staggered back, clutching my bag, eyes darting around the dark room. I could feel him, like a weight pressing down on me, the air thick with his presence. I bolted. I didn't even bother gathering my things. I just grabbed my keys and ran out the door, racing to my car. I could feel him behind me, could almost sense his eyes boring into the back of my head, that grin widening, mocking me. I didn't dare look back. Once in the car, I peeled out of the parking lot, speeding down the highway. The road was empty, my headlights carving through the darkness. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get as far away as possible. But as I drove, a creeping dread settled over me. No matter how fast I went, no matter how far I ran, I could feel him. It was as if he was already there, watching me from every shadow, waiting around every corner. After hours of driving, I reached a small town. The streets were empty, the houses dark, but I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to stop. I parked by an old diner and slumped over the steering wheel, too exhausted to go any further. As I sat there, I felt a chill seep into the car, and then another knock. But this time, it came from right beside me, tapping softly on the passenger window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head, and there he was, his face pressed against the glass. That same horrible grin stretched wide, his eyes dull and lifeless. "You can't run," he whispered, his breath fogging up the window. I screamed, slamming on the gas and tearing down the road, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't keep doing this. He was everywhere. No matter how fast I drove, no matter where I went, he was there, waiting for me. I don't remember how long I drove after that. Hours, maybe days. Time seemed to blur, reality slipping away. Eventually, I found myself back where it all began, the cabin. I don't know how I got there, or why I felt compelled to return, but something deep inside told me this was where it had to end. I stepped out of the car, the night pressing down on me, silent and suffocating. I could feel him watching me from the trees, his presence growing stronger with every step. I walked to the cabin door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The cabin was dark, exactly as I'd left it. The air was thick, heavy with a scent of decay that made me gag. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and stood there, waiting. And then I heard it, the familiar, slow knock, but this time it was coming from inside. My heart pounded as I turned, my flashlight sweeping through the darkness. There, standing in the corner, was the man, his grin wider than ever, his eyes empty and cold. "You let me in once," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty cabin, "and now I'm part of you." I backed away, but he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was savoring every second of my fear. Why are you doing this?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. "Because you invited me," he said, tilting his head. "You answered the door. You let me in." He reached out, his fingers cold as ice, brushing against my cheek. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, my vision blurring. I tried to pull away, but my limbs felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. "From now on, I'll always be with you," he murmured, his grin widening until it seemed to split his face in half. Darkness closed in around me, his voice echoing in my ears, whispering, "Forever." I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke, I was alone. The cabin was silent, empty. I stumbled outside, the morning light blinding me. My car was gone, my belongings scattered across the porch. Everything felt wrong, like I was looking at the world through a distorted lens. And then I saw it, A small bundle, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine, sitting on the steps. Hands shaking, I unwrapped it and found a single, polished bone. My own finger bone. I dropped it, a sickening realization dawning on me. The man hadn't just haunted me, he'd taken a part of me. And now, I could feel him, deep inside, like a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting to emerge. I left the cabin that day, but I know I'll never truly escape him, because now, he's always with me. In every reflection, every shadow, every whisper in the night. He's there, grinning, watching, waiting. And I know that one day, he'll come for the rest of me.